Coming up, a huge night for Damian Lillard, and the Nets, now at full strength, continue to roll. This is Locked On Game to Game NBA.
Every game, every team, every angle. Locked On Game to Game, your team every day.
Welcome in. You're listening to Locked On Game to Game NBA, local experts going over the biggest stories on the hardwood. I am your host, Kainani Stevens. Thank you for making Locked On your first listen every single weekday. The shorthanded Atlanta Hawks clearly drained from their comeback win against the Bulls the other night, and they did not bring much to the table when they took on Memphis. Locked On Hawks talks over the loss, while Locked On Grizzlies has more on the winning side.
Hello friends, my name is Brad Rowland, and the Atlanta Hawks go up to Memphis and fall, let's just say, in lopsided fashion, 128-103. The Hawks were extremely shorthanded in this game. On top of everything else, the Hawks had a back-to-back. Memphis was well rested, and it was definitely an uphill battle the entire way. The Hawks were without their top 5 players in this one, including Trae Young, Clint Capella, John Collins, DeJounte Murray, and Bogdan Bogdanovic, and the Hawks basically had not enough offensive creation firepower in this one, in addition to all kinds of defensive issues without Capella, and the Grizzlies were up by 30 plus along the way here. And while this is one that was expected in a lot of ways, it did get out of hand in a hurry, and it was sort of a reminder that the Hawks do not have a ton of depth on this roster. We'll get into what transpired and much more, as always, on the Locked On Hawks podcast.
Oh, what's that you say? The Memphis Grizzlies don't have John Morant? They don't have Desmond Bane? Surely they're not going to be capable of unloading on anybody, much less an Atlanta Hawks team supposedly desperate for a win. You thought wrong if that was the case. The Grizzlies have won 6 straight basketball games. I'm Joe Mullinax of Locked On Grizzlies, and no John Morant, no problem. It was an opportunity for guys like Jaren Jackson Jr. to show their value. He has single-handedly made the Grizzlies defense an elite one. They were middle of the pack in the entire National Basketball Association when it came to defensive rating before Jaren's return. Before the Hawks game, they had risen all the way up to 4th in the entire NBA. I have a sneaky suspicion the 8 blocks of Jaren are going to help the Grizzlies defense move up even higher in the rankings. A phenomenal performance from Jaren. Tyus Jones filled in admirably for Ja once again. Brandon Clark, John Conchar, even Kennedy Chandler got in on the fun. This Grizzlies team is fun.
The Celtics are certainly not enjoying their trip out west right about now. Kawhi Leonard and the Clippers took care of business against Boston on Monday. Locked On Clippers and Locked On Celtics fill us in on the late game.
The LA Clippers got their best win of the season on Monday night against the Boston Celtics, 113-93 at the Staples Center. I'm Darian Vaziri, host of Locked On Clippers, and I'm here to tell you why Kawhi Leonard is back. And when I mean back, I don't just mean on the court. He is looking slowly but surely like every bit of the Kawhi Leonard that was known as one of the best players in the league before he tore his ACL. A 25-point night on 10 for 12 shooting in this one. Paul George with 26 points as well for the Clippers, and huge contributions from role players Nicholas Batum, Terrence Mann, who was super active on the offensive glass and making all the little plays. And, of course, guys like Marcus Morris Sr. were hitting shots, and Luke Kennard as well. But I think the biggest thing for the Clippers in this game was their attention to detail and defensive effort. They were just a sharper team, the more active team, and the hungrier team from the first minute of the game, and that's why they're winners, 113-93.
Back-to-back stinkers for the Boston Celtics. Now they find themselves in a little bit of a pickle. I'm John Corrales of the Locked On Celtics podcast. The Celtics offense for the second straight game in 2 big matchups, Golden State and the Clippers, they just didn't have it. They are in a slump. The shooting, which has carried the Celtics to a historically great offense, has abandoned them. Guys that have bailed them out, like Derek White, Marcus Smart, those guys, Grant Williams, Sam Hauser, they are all slumping from 3. The Celtics, everything that they missed in this game seemed like it went front rim. That just means the Celtics had no legs, which really made sense because they couldn't get a stop. They couldn't get what they needed in their attempt to come back in this game. The Clippers, meanwhile, just couldn't miss. Kawhi had an amazing game. The Celtics could not find any answers. Uncharacteristic for them this season. And now there's a question of, when can they break out of this?
A blowout in Portland led to a lot of record-breaking numbers for the Trailblazers. Locked On Blazers and Locked On Timberwolves are in to go over the stats.
Record-setting in a runaway win. I'm Mike Richmond, host of Locked On Blazers, and that's what your Portland Trail Blazers did. Damian Lillard finishes with 11 made three-pointers and 38 points, and he did not play the fourth quarter because it was a rout, and he did not need to. He matched his own record, his own franchise record for made threes and a half with 8 when he had 8 in the first half. He matched his own franchise record for made threes in a game when he hit 11 through 3 quarters. He started 8 of 9 from 3. He was just burning down the nets. The Minnesota Timberwolves, their defense was stinky, and Damian Lillard made sure they knew how bad it smelled. It was a blowout. They rolled. The only question was, would Dame come back and play in the fourth quarter for a chance to chase, tie, or break Klay Thompson's all-time record for made threes in a game? Well, when the Blazers opened up a 26-point lead in the first 90 seconds of the fourth quarter, the decision was made for him. Not going to chase it in a blowout. It'll have to come some other time. Listen to Locked On Blazers for more.
It happened again for the second time in 3 nights. Damian Lillard went off on the Timberwolves, and the Wolves' perimeter defense was nowhere to be found. I'm Ben Beacon with the Locked On Wolves podcast, and Damian Lillard tied a career high with 11 made threes, including 8 in the first half. He scored 38, didn't even have to play the fourth quarter as the Blazers beat Minnesota by 21. This was the Wolves' second loss in Portland in the last 3 nights. And once again, it was point of attack defense. And really, this game was equal parts the Wolves playing shoddy defense on the perimeter, which is something we've grown accustomed to this year, unfortunately, but also Damian Lillard just being amazing. He made 15 free throws in the win Saturday. He made 11 threes in this game on Monday night. The Wolves tried Austin Rivers on him. They tried Kyle Anderson. Jaden McDaniels took the brunt of it. Dame could not be stopped. And the Wolves, even though they scored at will, they pretty much got what they wanted on their end of the floor. They just couldn't keep up with Portland, who got literally anything they wanted. Make sure to tune into the Locked On Wolves podcast for all things Timberwolves. We'll break this down on the post-game pod.
Coming up, the Spurs pull off the upset against the Cavs. This is Locked On Game to Game NBA. Today's edition of Locked On Game to Game is brought to you by Prize Picks. It is the super simple way for you to play daily fantasy sports. What you do is you pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projections, you can win up to 10 times your money on any single entry. You are not competing against anybody else. You're just competing against those projections, which is what makes it so fun. You go and download that Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match of up to $100 if you use the promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. So don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match of up to $100. Welcome in. You're listening to Locked On Game to Game NBA. I am your host, Kainani Stevens. Thank you so much for making Locked On your first listen every single weekday. 2 of the best defensive efforts so far this season led to the lowest scoring game so far this year between Miami and Indiana. Locked On Pacers and Locked On Heat go over that defensive battle.
Good news for the Indiana Pacers. They just had their best defensive game of the season, giving up 87 points to the Miami Heat. Bad news is that's where the good news stops, because the Pacers only scored 82 themselves, the lowest scoring NBA game this season, and the Pacers are on the bad end of it, losing 87-82 to the Miami Heat. This is what the Heat do. They're very good defensively, a top 5 defensive team. They can throw tons of different coverages at teams with zones and switches and attacking the ball, and they made Tyrese Haliburton uncomfortable. That's how they beat the Pacers. Tyrese Haliburton, 1 point, the second lowest of his career, his only point coming on a technical foul free throw. He didn't even draw a foul. 6 assists, one of his lowest totals this season. The Heat win because they took Tyrese Haliburton out of the game, right? A lot of other guys did well for the Pacers, but they didn't have the guy doing well for the Pacers. That's what they needed. The Pacers need to find a way to get him going, even though he had a strong impact. That's what they'll have to figure out in future games. And we'll break down all that and more on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
Well, it was the lowest scoring game of the NBA season, but the Heat beat the Pacers 87-82. I'm Wes Goldberg from Locked On Heat. It wasn't pretty. The Heat shot worse than 39%. The Pacers shot worse than 36%. Both teams went 4 whole minutes in the fourth quarter without making a single field goal. But Jimmy Butler scored 7 points down the stretch and gave the Heat enough for the win. And that's all that matters for the Heat, who began this 4-game trip with a much-needed win after dropping 3 of their last 4. Bam Adebayo was the Heat's best player, 22 points and 17 rebounds for him. The Heat still had plenty of issues in this one, though, going 9 of 34 from three-point range, too many fouls. But the biggest issue was that the offense actually looked fluid early in the game when Miami got out to a 19-point lead, but then the offense stalled. The Heat let the Pacers back into the game, and they had to grind this one out. Still, a win is a win, and the Heat are not in a position right now to be picky. For more on tonight's game, check out Locked On Heat on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.
It was a tale of two halves for Dallas, who turned it on just in time to get the win over the Thunder yesterday. Locked On Thunder and Locked On Magic give us all the details.
The Dallas Mavericks get a win after two bad losses. Nick Angstead from the Locked On Mavericks podcast here, and the Dallas Mavericks played terribly in the first quarter. The worst offense we may have seen this entire year from them, bricking three after three after three. And in the second quarter, they just turned it on. A completely different team. This team lives and dies by the three, by maybe more than any team in the NBA. But they hit 10 of 16 threes in the second quarter, and that turned out to be their saving grace because they held on to the game for basically the rest of it. They held on to control. Luka Doncic and Spencer Dinwiddie combined for 58 points, 18 rebounds, and 18 assists. Triple-double watch for both of those guys. They were huge, and Jason Kidd changed up some of the rotations. He changed up a couple of things. Tim Hardaway Jr. had 20 points. He stayed in there for a little bit longer. Bullock hit 3 threes. He stayed out there for a little bit longer than normal. Frank Ntilikina got some extended run for the defense that he was playing. The Mavericks changed it up just a little bit, and they end up getting a win against the Thunder.
The Oklahoma City Thunder fall to the Dallas Mavericks, but that's not really important. The Thunder fought hard on the last leg of a 5-game road trip that spanned 11 days away from home. The Thunder did, however, put full display their grit and toughness, but also the tale of a winning formula for the Oklahoma City Thunder. It's all about shooting. When Isaiah Joe's in the game and can knock down 3-point shots, everything goes smoother, and the Thunder have already invested in future 3-point shooting. They've got to keep doing that as they flesh out this roster for the rest of the rebuild. We'll talk about that and more coming up on the Locked On Thunder podcast.
Washington's struggles continue, losing to a surging Brooklyn Nets team on Monday. Locked On Wizards are in with what went wrong last night.
What's good, everybody? It's your boy Brandon Scott again from Locked On Wizards. So the Washington Wizards lose their 7th loss in a row, this time to the Brooklyn Nets tonight, 112-100 in D.C. Now, how did the Wizards lose this game? Well, injuries had a big part to do with it. They were already without their franchise player, Bradley Beal, without their starting and second unit point guards in DeLon Wright and Monte Morris, and were without their scorer off the bench in Rui Hachimura. But then Kristaps Porzingis left the game with back tightness. So Kyle Kuzma and Will Barton had to carry the offensive load tonight. Now, with this being the 7th loss in a row for the Wizards, it doesn't get it easier. They're going on a 6-game West Coast road trip. It's going to test his depth. So getting these guys back from injury will help the Wizards out, but it's going to be a heck of a road trip going forward. So again, thank you for watching tonight and have a good night.
One of the upsets of the season so far this year, the Spurs took down the Cavs last night, and Locked On Cavs had some questions about this team playing on the road.
Hey everyone, Evan Damerl here, co-host of Locked On Cavs with the Locked On Now takeaway after the Cleveland Cavaliers Monday night loss to the San Antonio Spurs. The Cavs just are not a good road team. And let's just be frank. They have the best home record. They're the best defensive team. But for whatever reason, when they go on the road, demons seem to plague them in every step of the way. They did show a lot of fight down the stretch against San Antonio. Evan Mobley going 1-2 at the free throw line was suboptimal way to close things if you're Cleveland, though, just because if he makes that, you tie the game, he just goes to overtime. But I think more than anything, the biggest indictment on this Cavs game was the fact that Cleveland had a timeout in the closing moments when Donovan Mitchell grabbed that rebound and there was still about 10 seconds to go. The Cavs could have drawn up an easy play and maybe figured this out and won the game, or at least forced overtime. Hear about this and more on tomorrow's Locked On Cavs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
That's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Game to Game NBA. Thank you for making Locked On your first listen every single weekday. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On NBA and, of course, your favorite teams Locked On podcasts, both on YouTube and wherever else you get your podcasts. I'm Kainani Stevens. This has been Locked On Game to Game.